A retired war dog lives in seclusion in an animal shelter. A veteran finds him, but the dog doesn't immediately recognize him. What happens next is heartwarming. The sunset painted the sky of Denver, Colorado with orange and purple hues as Michael Andrews walked with hesitant steps towards the municipal animal shelter. His worn boots echoed against the pavement, each step laden with the weight of memories accumulated since leaving the army 2 years ago. At 37, the premature wrinkles on his tanned face told stories of sleepless nights and nightmares he preferred to forget. The shelter building loomed before him, a modest structure with faded walls and rusty fences. The smell of disinfectant mingled with distant barks, creating a symphony that echoed in his ears. The social worker, a young woman named Carrie, greeted him with an understanding smile. "Mr. Andrews, your sister Lisa called to let us know you were coming," said Carrie, guiding him through the hallways. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Michael nodded silently, his dark eyes scanning the cages. Some dogs approached excitedly, wagging their tails enthusiastically. Others simply observed him with melancholy eyes. But none made his heart beat faster. None awakened that recognition he secretly hoped to find. "We have a special case," Carrie mentioned, after several minutes of walking. "A German Shepherd that arrived 3 months ago. He's different." Carrie's words immediately caught his attention. They continued walking until they reached a more secluded area of the shelter, where the most challenging cases were cared for. In a corner, partially hidden by shadows, lay a dog with dark fur and a distant gaze. Michael stopped in his tracks. His legs became heavy as lead as he observed the animal. The German Shepherd had visible scars on its body, but it was its eyes that told the true story. Empty, distrustful, as if they had seen too much. "Can I?" Michael whispered, pointing towards the cage. Carrie nodded, carefully opening the door. "Be careful. He doesn't usually respond well to strangers." Michael approached slowly, his heart pounding hard against his chest. He knelt at a safe distance, extending his hand with the palm up. The dog looked at him without moving, showing no signs of recognition or aggression. "Hello, buddy," Michael murmured, his voice breaking slightly. "Do you remember me?" The silence that followed was deafening. The German Shepherd remained motionless, its eyes fixed on Michael but showing no emotion. To any observer, it might seem like an insignificant encounter, but for Michael that moment was loaded with meaning. Lisa, his sister, had insisted for months that he visit the shelter. "You need something to anchor you to life," she had said. "Someone who understands you." Michael had resisted, arguing that he wasn't ready, that maybe he never would be. But now, faced with this wounded dog, he felt something stir within him. "What's his story?" Michael asked, not taking his eyes off the animal. Carrie consulted her notes. They found him wandering on the outskirts of the city. From his scars and behavior, the veterinarians suspect he has a military past. He has rejected any attempt at connection until now. Michael nodded slowly, recognizing in the animal the same pain he carried. The similarities were too obvious to ignore. Both bore invisible scars, both struggled to trust again. "I'll come back tomorrow," he finally said, standing up with determination. "And the day after, and the next." Carrie looked at him with a mixture of surprise and hope. "Are you sure it won't be easy?" "I know," Michael replied, a small smile forming on his lips, "but something tells me we need each other." As he left the shelter, the sun had completely set, giving way to a starry night. Michael looked back one last time, seeing the silhouette of the German Shepherd through the window. He didn't know exactly what awaited him, but for the first time in a long time he felt he had a purpose. On the way home, his mind wandered to memories of his time in the army, shared missions with his former canine partner, nights under the stars in the desert. Maybe, he thought, fate was giving him a second chance, a chance to heal, not just himself, but also another being who had lost its way. The next morning dawned cloudy, as if the sky reflected the uncertainty Michael felt as he prepared a small backpack. Inside he placed some objects he had kept for years in a box under his bed: an old military vest, a worn rubber ball, and a collar that had belonged to his former canine partner. Lisa appeared at his door unannounced, as she had been doing since he returned to civilian life. "Are you going back to the shelter?" she asked as she poured herself coffee in Michael's kitchen. "I need to try," he replied, adjusting the straps of the backpack. "There's something about that dog, Lisa, something familiar." His sister looked at him with a mixture of concern and hope. "Michael, I don't want you to get your hopes up too much. It's been 2 years, and even if it were him—" "I know," he interrupted gently. "I'm not looking for miracles, just a possibility." At the shelter, Carrie greeted him with a surprised smile. "I didn't expect to see you so early, Mr. Andrews." "Michael," he corrected. "Just Michael is fine." They walked to the special area where the German Shepherd remained. The dog was in the same position as the day before, as if it hadn't moved all night. Its eyes were still distant, but there was something different in its posture when Michael approached. "I brought you some things," Michael murmured, sitting on the floor at a safe distance. He took out the military vest first, placing it between them. The dog slightly raised its head, its nostrils dilating as it caught the scent. Carrie watched from the door, fascinated. "It's the first time he's shown so much interest in something," she whispered. Michael extracted the rubber ball next, rolling it gently towards the animal. The German Shepherd looked at it fixedly but made no move to reach for it. Its eyes, however, seemed more alert, more present. "Do you remember these things, buddy?" Michael asked in a low voice. "We used to train with them. You were the best, the bravest." The hours passed slowly. Michael alternated between talking softly to the dog and simply sitting in silence, allowing his presence to become familiar. As the sun began to descend, Carrie approached again. "We have to close soon," she said with regret. "But you can come back tomorrow." Michael nodded, gathering his things but leaving the military vest. "Can he keep this tonight?" he asked Carrie. "Of course," she replied, noticing how the dog kept its gaze fixed on the vest. That night in his apartment, Michael found himself reviewing old photographs. In one of them, he appeared next to a German Shepherd in the middle of the desert, both wearing military gear. The image was worn at the edges, but the connection between the soldier and the dog was evident. Lisa arrived with dinner, accompanied by her 7-year-old son, Peter. "How did it go?" she asked as she served the food. "Different," Michael replied, putting away the photos. "It's as if we both knew we needed each other, but neither knew how to take the first step." Peter, who was playing with his toys on the floor, looked up. "Uncle, is the dog sad like you were when you came back?" The child's innocent comment hit Michael hard. Lisa tried to change the subject, but he responded, "Yes, Peter, I think he's as sad as I was. But maybe we can help each other be happy again." The following days established a routine. Michael arrived early at the shelter, spent hours with the German Shepherd, sometimes reading aloud, other times simply sitting in silence. Gradually, he noticed small changes. The dog began to approach the military vest during the nights, according to Carrie, and its eyes followed Michael's movements with more attention. One afternoon, while Michael was talking about his days in the army, the dog moved. It was an almost imperceptible movement, but it came a few inches closer to him. Michael held his breath, his heart beating hard. He made no sudden movements, allowing the animal to control the situation. "It's okay," he whispered. "We're safe here, both of us." Carrie, who was passing by at that moment, stopped in her tracks, watching the scene in amazement. It was the first voluntary approach the dog had shown since its arrival at the shelter. That night, as Michael prepared to leave, he noticed that the German Shepherd followed him with its gaze to the door. There was no longer emptiness in those eyes, but a spark of something that seemed like recognition. "I'll be back tomorrow," Michael promised, as he did every night. But this time, for the first time, he thought he saw a slight movement in the dog's tail, an almost imperceptible sign of hope. The news came like an unexpected blow on a Thursday morning. Michael found Carrie in her office, reviewing papers with a worried expression. Her eyes were reddened as if she had been crying. "The shelter is in trouble," she confessed when Michael asked what was happening. "Municipal funds have been cut, and we have 3 months to get private support or we'll be forced to close." Michael felt the ground move beneath his feet. "What will happen to the animals?" "They would transfer them to other shelters in different cities," Carrie replied, her voice breaking slightly. "Some to Boston, others to Chicago, wherever there's space." The idea that the German Shepherd could be sent away just when they were starting to connect made Michael feel a knot in his stomach. He ran his hand through his hair, a nervous gesture he had developed during his years of service. "There must be something we can do," he said, more to himself than to Carrie. That afternoon, while he was with the German Shepherd, Michael noticed that the animal seemed to sense his unease. For the first time since they began his visits, the dog approached close enough for Michael to feel its breath. "I'm not going to let them take you away," he murmured, slowly extending his hand. The German Shepherd sniffed it cautiously, its eyes fixed on Michael. "We'll find a solution." Lisa arrived at the shelter that afternoon, after Michael told her the situation over the phone. Peter came with her, holding a drawing he had made at school, a dog and a man under a bright sun. "Can I give him my drawing?" asked the boy, looking curiously at the German Shepherd. Michael hesitated for a moment, but something in his instinct told him it was okay. "Very slowly, Peter, and stay close to me." The boy approached cautiously, holding the drawing in front of him like a shield. To everyone's surprise, the dog didn't back away. Its eyes moved between Michael and Peter, as if evaluating the situation. "It's for you," Peter said quietly, leaving the drawing on the floor near the dog. "Uncle Michael says you're sad, but that you're going to get better." The German Shepherd looked at the drawing and then at the boy. Slowly, very slowly, its tail moved once, an almost imperceptible gesture that made Peter smile widely. Lisa watched the scene with tears in her eyes. "Michael," she said later, while Peter colored more drawings sitting in a corner, "I have an idea to help the shelter." As an elementary school teacher, Lisa had connections with other schools and parents. "We could organize a fundraising campaign," she suggested. "Involve the community, show them stories like yours and the German Shepherds." Michael nodded slowly, an idea forming in his mind. "And I know other veterans," he added. "Some of them are also struggling to readjust. Maybe we could create a special program." Carrie, who had joined the conversation, began taking notes frantically. "An animal therapy program for veterans," she said, excited. "We could apply for specific funds for that." As they discussed the details, Michael noticed that the German Shepherd had come closer, almost as if it were listening. Peter's drawing lay next to it, and for the first time, Michael saw something different in its eyes. Interest. That night, before leaving, Michael sat on the floor next to the cage. "You know, when I came back from service, I thought I was alone," he confessed quietly, "that no one could understand. But look at me now, surrounded by people who want to help. Maybe it's time for both of us to learn to trust again." The German Shepherd looked at him intently, and for a moment Michael swore he saw a flash of understanding in its eyes. The animal approached the bars and for the first time allowed Michael to gently touch its head. Lisa, who had returned after taking Peter home, found her brother with tears in his eyes. "Are you okay?" she asked, concerned. Michael nodded, not taking his eyes off the dog. "For the first time in a long time," he replied. "I think we both will be." That night, while driving home, Michael began making calls, first to his former army comrades, then to veterans organizations. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Everyone wanted to help. "We're going to save this place," he promised the next day, as the German Shepherd greeted him with a more noticeable tail movement. "And we're going to help others who are as lost as we were." The shelter's community room had never been so full. Michael watched in amazement as veterans, teachers, parents, and volunteers filled every available space. Lisa had organized this first meeting to present the Shelter Salvation Project, and the response exceeded all expectations. Carrie had prepared a presentation on the current situation of the shelter, but before starting, Michael asked for the floor. He stood in front of everyone, his hands slightly shaky, but his voice firm. "A month ago," he began, "I walked through those doors not knowing what to expect. I was lost, though I wouldn't admit it. Then I met a German Shepherd that reminded me that sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones you can't see." The audience listened in respectful silence as Michael shared his story. He talked about his days in the army, about the loneliness of returning, and about how a wounded dog was teaching him to trust again. "This shelter is not just a place for abandoned animals," he continued. "It's a space for healing, for second chances. And today I ask you to help us keep it open." Richard, a veteran who had served with Michael, was the first to stand up. "We could organize training sessions," he suggested. "Many of us have experience working with military dogs." Ideas began to flow. Lisa presented a plan to involve local schools in educational programs about animal care. Other veterans proposed creating an animal-assisted therapy program for their comrades who were facing difficulties in their return to civilian life. In the middle of the meeting, Carrie came running into the room. "Michael," she called in a low but urgent voice, "you need to come. It's the German Shepherd." Michael excused himself and followed Carrie to the special area where they kept the dog. The animal was restless, moving from side to side in its space, something unusual for it. He started like this when he heard your voice over the speakers, Carrie explained. I've never seen him so agitated. Michael approached the cage, speaking softly. Hey, buddy, I'm here. The German Shepherd stopped, its eyes fixed on Michael. Then, to the surprise of both, it approached and pressed its nose against Michael's hand through the bars. Do you want to come out? Michael asked, looking at Carrie for approval. She nodded, handing him the key. With slow and deliberate movements, Michael opened the door. The German Shepherd took a tentative step forward, then another. Without warning, it came close enough for Michael to touch its fur completely for the first time. Amazing, Carrie whispered, watching the scene with tears in her eyes. Michael knelt next to the dog, allowing the animal to smell him and become familiar with his closer presence. You've been waiting for the right moment, haven't you? He murmured. Lisa, who had come out to look for them, stopped in her tracks when she saw the scene. Her brother, the same one who had returned from the army so closed off and distant, was sitting on the floor next to the German Shepherd, with a genuine smile on his face. The meeting, she began to say, but stopped when she saw the connection that was developing in front of her. Tell them I'll be back in a moment, Michael replied without taking his eyes off the dog. This is important. The German Shepherd had sat next to Michael, allowing him to gently stroke its head. Its eyes, once so empty, now showed a glimmer of recognition and trust. You know, Michael said softly, all those plans they're making in there, all those ideas to help, it all started with you. You're helping us all to be better. In response, the dog gently rested its head on Michael's knee. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. Carrie, who was still watching, quickly took a photo with her phone. For the project, she explained when Michael looked at her, people need to see this. They need to understand why this place is so special. When they finally returned to the meeting, Michael brought the German Shepherd with him, held by a soft leash. The room fell silent as they entered together. Let me introduce you, Michael said with an emotional voice, to the reason we're all here today. The weeks following the first community meeting brought renewed energy to the shelter. The faded walls began to come to life with murals that Lisa's school students painted on weekends. The backyard, previously neglected, was gradually transformed into a training area thanks to the volunteer work of the veterans. Michael arrived earlier every morning, eager to see the German Shepherd. The dog, which now responded to the name Shadow, a name Michael had chosen because of the way the animal silently followed him, showed notable improvements in its behavior. It's like he's a different dog, Carrie commented one morning as she watched Shadow following some basic commands that Michael gave him. And you've changed too, Michael. It was true. The transformation was evident to everyone who knew him. His eyes had regained their sparkle, and his posture no longer reflected the invisible weight he seemed to carry before. Lisa arrived that morning with Peter and a surprise, the first significant donation check for the shelter, the result of a fundraising event at her school. The kids organized a fair, she explained, while Peter ran to greet Shadow, who now allowed the boy to approach with confidence. Each class symbolically adopted a dog from the shelter and sold crafts to help. Michael watched the interaction between his nephew and Shadow with a smile. The dog, although still cautious with most people, had developed a special bond with Peter. Maybe it was the child's innocence, or perhaps his calm way of approaching, but Shadow seemed to relax in his presence. Uncle Michael, Peter called, holding a ball he had brought. Do you think Shadow wants to play today? It was an important question. Until now, Shadow had shown little interest in typical dog games or activities. He remained alert, vigilant, as if he was still in service mode. We can try, Michael replied, approaching cautiously. But remember, no sudden movements. Peter nodded solemnly and gently rolled the ball towards Shadow. The dog looked at it curiously, his ears moving slightly forward. To everyone's surprise, after a moment of hesitation, Shadow approached the ball and gently pushed it with his nose. He did it, Peter exclaimed in a low voice, containing his excitement so as not to scare the dog. The scene attracted Richard's attention, who had arrived for a training session with other dogs. That's a big step forward, he commented, keeping his distance so as not to intimidate Shadow. It reminds me of the early days of training in the K9 unit. Michael nodded, remembering his own training days. It's like starting over, he said, but this time it's different. We're not training for service, but for life. Lisa, who had been taking photos of the moment, showed her phone to Carrie. "We should share these images on the shelter's social media," she suggested. "People need to see these stories of hope." Carrie enthusiastically agreed. "We've already received more visits since we started sharing Michael and Shadow's story. People see that these dogs are not lost causes. They just need time and patience." While the adults talked, Peter continued his quiet game with Shadow. The dog had started returning the ball on his own, though he did so with measured and cautious movements. "You know what, Uncle?" Peter suddenly said. "I think Shadow smiles when he's with you." Michael looked at his canine companion attentively. It was true that Shadow's expression had changed in recent weeks. His eyes no longer showed that emptiness that had impacted Michael so much in their first encounter. "We all deserve a second chance to smile," Michael replied, crouching down to gently pet Shadow behind the ears. The day continued, with more small but significant advances. Richard began planning more structured training sessions for the other dogs in the shelter, using the experience of the volunteer veterans. Lisa organized a calendar of school visits to educate children about responsible pet care. At sunset, as Michael prepared to leave, he noticed that Shadow was looking at him differently. There was no longer fear in those eyes, only a quiet and gradual trust. "Tomorrow will be a better day," Michael promised, as he did every night. But this time, when he walked away, he heard something that made him stop. A soft bark, the first Shadow had given since his arrival at the shelter. The weather forecast had warned about the storm, but no one expected it to be so intense. Dark clouds gathered over Denver during the afternoon, bringing with them thunders that shook the windows of the shelter. Michael noticed the change in Shadow even before the rain began. The German Shepherd was restless, his ears moving nervously at each distant thunder. Carrie had suggested taking him home that night, worried about how he might react to the storm. "It's the first time he'll face something like this since he started improving," she said, handing Michael the temporary custody papers. "It could be a setback if he stays alone." The rain began to fall heavily as Michael drove to his apartment with Shadow in the back seat. The dog maintained his composure, but his eyes revealed growing anxiety. "Easy, buddy," Michael murmured, looking at him in the rearview mirror. "It's just water." But they both knew it wasn't just water. The thunders brought memories, distant explosions, nights in the desert, moments of constant tension and alertness. Michael felt his own pulse quicken with each flash of lightning. Upon arriving at the apartment, Shadow entered cautiously, sniffing the unfamiliar environment. Michael had prepared a space for him in the living room with a new bed and some toys that Lisa and Peter had helped choose. "This is your home tonight," said Michael, letting the dog explore on his own. "You're safe here." The storm intensified as night fell. The thunders rumbled closer now, and the rain beat against the windows fiercely. Shadow began to show signs of distress. His breathing accelerated, and he sought corners to hide. Michael recognized these symptoms. He had experienced them himself during his first months back. The racing heart, the feeling of imminent danger, the desire to escape. Without thinking, he sat on the floor near where Shadow had taken refuge. "You know, I was afraid of them too," he began to speak in a low voice. "The storms reminded me of difficult moments, but my sister Lisa taught me something. Counting between the thunders. It's a way to keep the mind occupied." A particularly loud thunder shook the building. Shadow shuddered, and for a moment Michael feared that all progress would be lost. But then the dog did something unexpected. He approached Michael, seeking his presence. 1, 2, 3. Michael began to count out loud and calmly. Shadow looked at him intently, his ears moving to the rhythm of his voice. 4, 5. Another thunder resonated, but this time Shadow didn't retreat. He stayed next to Michael, allowing him to place a hand gently on his back. "That's it, buddy. It's easier together," Michael murmured. The hours passed slowly. Michael kept his voice constant, alternating between counting and talking softly about everyday topics, plans for the shelter, Peter's visits, the new routines they were building. At some point during the night, Lisa called to see how they were doing. "How is he handling it?" she asked, concerned. "Better than I expected," Michael replied, looking at Shadow, who now rested beside him. "I think we're both doing better." Near midnight, the storm began to move away. The thunders became more distant, and the rain softened to a gentle drizzle. Shadow had visibly relaxed, though he still kept close to Michael. "We made it, partner," said Michael, allowing himself a tired smile. "Our first storm together." At that moment, looking at the dog that had come into his life so unexpectedly, Michael understood something important. Healing didn't mean never being afraid again. It meant learning to face those fears, preferably with someone by your side. Morning arrived with a washed and bright sky. Michael found Shadow awake, vigilant but calm, observing the first rays of sun filtering through the window. "Ready to go back to the shelter?" Michael asked while preparing breakfast for both of them. Shadow looked at him with those eyes that now showed renewed confidence, and Michael knew they had overcome more than just a storm that night. They had taken another important step in their shared path towards recovery. The morning after the storm marked a turning point in the relationship between Michael and Shadow. Upon arriving at the shelter, Carrie immediately noticed the change. The German Shepherd walked closer to Michael, without the usual tension in his movements. "Something changed last night," she observed, while preparing the documents for the first official session of the animal therapy program. "We understood each other," Michael replied simply, looking at Shadow with a soft smile. "Sometimes you need to go through a storm to find calm." The shelter was buzzing with activity that morning. Richard had brought 3 new veterans, all interested in the program after seeing the photos shared on social media. Lisa was also present, organizing a school visit that would arrive later. "Do you think Shadow is ready for this?" she asked, observing the preparations. Michael knelt next to the dog, looking him in the eyes. "What do you say, partner? Shall we help others like we helped each other last night?" To everyone's surprise, Shadow approached one of the newly arrived veterans, a young man named Martin, who hadn't stopped shaking since he entered the shelter. The dog sat quietly near him, without making direct contact, but offering a comforting presence. "It's incredible," Richard whispered. "It's as if he knows who needs the most support." Martin, initially tense, began to relax gradually. "He reminds me of my canine partner in Afghanistan," he said quietly. He had that same understanding look. The morning passed with a series of small victories. The veterans worked with different dogs from the shelter, but everyone watched fascinated the interaction between Michael and Shadow. The connection between them had deepened, becoming more natural and fluid. Peter arrived after school, excited to show Shadow a new trick he had learned for training dogs. To his delight, the German Shepherd responded positively, following his instructions with patient attention. "Uncle Michael," the boy exclaimed, "Shadow is happier today." It was true. The dog showed a new confidence, as if the shared experience during the storm had dissipated some of his last reservations. Carrie took the moment to share more good news. Donations had increased significantly after they shared Michael and Shadow's story on social media. Several local businesses had offered to sponsor the therapy program. "People see hope in your story," she explained. "They see that recovery is possible, that love and patience can work miracles." During the afternoon, while the veterans shared their experiences in an informal circle, Shadow moved among them, offering his comforting presence to whoever needed it. Michael watched with pride as his companion, once so fearful, now became a source of comfort for others. Lisa approached her brother, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Remember when I first suggested you come here?" she asked softly. Michael nodded, not taking his eyes off Shadow. "I thought I was coming to save a dog," he replied. "I didn't realize he would save me." At the end of the day, as the sun began to set, Michael and Shadow walked together through the shelter's yard. The renovation works were progressing well. The new training areas were taking shape, and the cheerful murals gave life to the walls. "You know," Michael said to his companion, "I think it's time to make this official." He took some papers out of his backpack, the adoption forms that Carrie had given him that morning. Shadow looked at him with those eyes that now shone with intelligence and trust. His tail moved softly, a gesture that had become more frequent in recent days. "What do you say? Do you want to come home with me? This time for good?" In response, Shadow moved closer to Michael, resting his head against his leg in a gesture of total trust. It was all the yes he needed. Michael's apartment, once an austere space that reflected his years of military service, began to transform. Shadow's bed occupied a cozy corner of the living room, surrounded by carefully selected toys. New photos decorated the walls, Shadow with Peter at the shelter, the team of veterans during therapy sessions, Lisa smiling while petting the German Shepherd. "It's as if the place finally breathed," Lisa commented during her first visit after the official adoption. "It has life." Michael nodded, watching how Shadow explored the apartment with more confidence than during the night of the storm. The dog had established his own routines. He slept near the window, where he could watch the street, and always accompanied Michael during his morning exercise sessions. "I never thought I'd have this again," Michael confessed as he prepared coffee for his sister. "A connection like this." Mornings acquired a new rhythm. Shadow woke Michael at dawn, ready for their walk. The neighbors in the building, initially cautious of the large German Shepherd, soon got used to seeing them together. Mrs. Thompson, from the apartment downstairs, even started keeping special dog treats. "My husband was in the military," she told Michael one day. "I see how you take care of each other. It's beautiful." At the shelter, where they still went almost every day, Shadow had become a kind of ambassador for the therapy program. His transformation inspired other veterans to believe in their own recovery. One Tuesday morning, as Michael prepared breakfast, he noticed something different about Shadow. The dog was sitting by the door with alert ears and his tail moving softly. "What's up, buddy?" Michael asked. In response, Shadow approached the kitchen and returned with his leash in his mouth. It was the first time he had shown such clear initiative. "You want to go out? Now?" The walk took them to a nearby park that they used to avoid due to the noise and the number of people. However, this time Shadow seemed determined. He stopped in front of a playground where several children were playing under their parents' supervision. Michael held his breath, worried about how Shadow would react to so much movement. But the dog remained calm, observing with interest. A small child approached, asking permission to pet him. "Carefully," Michael warned, surprised when Shadow lowered his head, allowing the contact. Soon other children approached, attracted by the calm and majestic dog. Michael watched in amazement as Shadow interacted with them, patient and gentle. "He's a very special dog," a mother commented, approaching Michael. "You can tell he's been through a lot, but he hasn't lost his capacity to love." That afternoon, when Lisa arrived with Peter for their usual visit, she found Michael sitting on the couch, working on his laptop, while Shadow slept at his feet. "What are you doing?" she asked, curious to see her brother so concentrated. "I'm writing our story," he replied, pointing to the screen. Carrie suggested it could help other veterans and their families. Show them there's hope. Peter sat next to Shadow, who woke up softly and moved his tail in recognition. The boy began to tell him about his day at school, and the dog listened attentively, as if he understood every word. "You know what my teacher told me today?" Peter suddenly asked. "That the best families aren't the ones born together, but the ones that choose each other." Michael looked at his nephew, then at Shadow, and finally at Lisa, who had tears in her eyes. "Your teacher is very wise," he replied with a smile. That night, as he prepared dinner, Michael reflected on how his life had changed in such a short time. The loneliness that had accompanied him since his return from the army had dissipated, replaced by a sense of purpose and connection. Shadow approached, resting his head on Michael's knee as he cut vegetables. It was his way of saying, "I'm here," a simple but deeply meaningful gesture. "Thank you," Michael murmured, scratching his companion's ears. "For choosing me, too." The shelter had transformed over the past few months. What was once a somber place now vibrated with energy and hope. The walls, covered with colorful murals painted by Lisa's students, told stories of second chances. The yard, previously neglected, had been converted into a professional training space where veterans and dogs worked together on their recovery. Carrie could barely contain her excitement as she showed the facilities to a group of city officials. "It all started with them," she explained, pointing to Michael and Shadow, who were working with a new group of veterans in the training area. Michael and Shadow's story had become a symbol of hope. Local media had published reports about the therapy program, attracting attention from other cities interested in replicating the model. "It's more than a rehabilitation program," Michael explained to the visitors. "It's a space where both humans and animals can heal together." Richard, who now coordinated the training program, had noticed an interesting pattern. The most fearful or traumatized dogs responded especially well to veterans facing similar challenges. "It's as if they recognize each other," he commented while observing Martin, one of the first veterans to join the program, working with a recently rescued dog. "They understand each other's pain without needing words." Lisa had integrated the program into her school curriculum, regularly bringing groups of students to learn about responsibility and empathy. The children, inspired by Shadow's story, had initiated a school-wide campaign to help the shelter. "Children understand something that many adults forget," Lisa said during one of the educational sessions. "That love can heal any wound if you give it enough time." One afternoon, while Michael was supervising a therapy session, he noticed something extraordinary. Shadow, on his own initiative, approached a female veteran who had remained apart from the group, visibly anxious. The German Shepherd sat quietly next to her, offering his silent presence as he had done so many times with Michael. "Her name is Anna," Carrie explained later. "It's her first time here. She hadn't spoken to anyone until Shadow approached her. At the end of the session, Anna approached Michael with tears in her eyes. "Your dog. He reminded me that I'm not alone," she said softly. "How did he know I needed it?" Michael smiled, petting Shadow. "He understands pain better than anyone. And he also knows how to help overcome it." The success of the program had attracted significant donations. The shelter had not only avoided closure, but was now planning to expand. Carrie presented plans for a new wing dedicated exclusively to animal-assisted therapy. "We want to create a center of excellence," she explained during a team meeting. "A place where other shelters can learn to implement similar programs." Peter, who now spent almost every weekend at the shelter, had developed a special bond not only with Shadow, but with all the dogs. The volunteers smiled as they saw him reading stories to the shyest dogs, sitting patiently in front of their cages. "Dogs are like people," he explained one day to a group of visitors with the innocent wisdom of a child. "Sometimes they're sad because something bad happened to them, but with love and patience they can be happy again." One afternoon, as Michael and Shadow rested after a particularly intense session, Lisa joined them with exciting news. The program had been selected to receive a National Social Innovation Award. "They want you to present our story at the award ceremony," she said, handing him the official letter. Michael looked at Shadow, who returned his gaze with those eyes that now shone with confidence and serenity. "Our story," he gently corrected. "It's the story of all of us." The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with the same hues that Michael remembered from that first day at the shelter. But now, as he observed the transformed space and the lives that had changed, including his own, he knew they had created something truly special. "You know, Shadow," he murmured, as they walked together towards the exit, "sometimes the best things in life begin with a simple step of faith." The news of the National Award had caused a stir at the shelter. Michael found himself reviewing his notes once again in Carrie's office, while Shadow rested quietly at his feet. The ceremony would be in 2 weeks in Washington, D.C., and the idea of speaking in front of hundreds of people made him nervous. "I don't know if I can do it," he confessed to Lisa during one of her visits. "Public speaking was never my thing." "But this time it will be different," she replied, pointing to Shadow. "You won't be alone." The event organizers had been delighted when Michael suggested that Shadow accompany him on stage. "His presence is fundamental to the story," he had explained in the coordination call. "I couldn't tell it without him." Richard and the other veterans had insisted on helping with the preparation of the speech. Each one contributed their perspective on how the program had impacted their lives. "You should tell them about Anna," Martin suggested, "how Shadow helped her on her first day. Those small moments are what best explain what we do here." Peter had taken on the responsibility of helping Shadow prepare for the event. He spent hours training him to be in front of the public, although the German Shepherd had already proven to be exceptionally calm in social situations. "Uncle Michael," he said one afternoon while brushing Shadow's fur, "do you think he'll get nervous with so many people?" Michael smiled, watching the interaction between his nephew and his companion. "I think he'll be the calmest of the two of us." Carrie had organized several rehearsals in the local auditorium, allowing Michael and Shadow to get used to being on stage. To everyone's surprise, Shadow seemed to perfectly understand his role, remaining serene and attentive next to Michael. "It's as if he knows how important this is," Carrie commented, after a particularly successful rehearsal. One afternoon, as Michael practiced his speech at home, he noticed Shadow watching him with particular attention. The dog approached and rested his head on Michael's knee, as he always did when he sensed his anxiety. "You know what's the hardest part?" Michael confided, stroking his ears. "Finding the right words to explain what you mean to me. How you changed my life. Lisa had insisted on buying a new suit for the occasion and had even gotten an elegant collar for Shadow. You'll be the most stylish pair at the event, she joked as Michael tried on the jacket. The entire shelter had thrown itself into the preparations. Lisa's school children had prepared a documentary video about the program, interviewing veterans and volunteers. The images of Shadow working with different people were particularly moving. It's incredible to see everything in perspective, Michael commented as he watched the video. How far we've come since that first day. Anna, who was now a regular participant in the program, had written a letter to be included in the presentation. Before I met you, she wrote, I thought I was alone in my struggle. Shadow and Michael taught me that healing is possible when we allow ourselves to be helped. As the date approached, Michael's nerves increased, but so did his determination. Each morning, during his walks with Shadow, he mentally reviewed what he wanted to convey: the importance of patience, the power of connection, the beauty of second chances. What if we mess up? He asked Shadow one night as he reviewed his speech for the umpteenth time. In response, Shadow brought his old play ball and left it at Michael's feet. It was his way of telling him to relax, that some things were simpler than they seemed. The night before leaving for the capital, Lisa organized a small gathering at the shelter. The whole team was there. Carrie, Richard, Martin, Anna, the volunteers, even Mrs. Thompson from Michael's building. Whatever happens tomorrow, Carrie said, raising her glass in a toast, you've already accomplished something extraordinary here. You've shown that love and understanding can transform lives. Michael looked around, at his sister Lisa, who never stopped believing in him, at Peter, who had grown so much through this experience, at his fellow veterans, who had found a new purpose, and at Shadow, his faithful companion, who looked at him with those eyes that now overflowed with confidence and love. Tomorrow we'll just tell our truth, Michael said, kneeling to hug Shadow. The story of how a broken dog and a broken man found each other and learned to heal together. The auditorium of the Washington Convention Center was packed to capacity. Michael waited backstage, nervously adjusting his tie while Shadow sat calmly beside him, as serene as ever. Lisa, Peter, and the rest of the shelter team occupied the front rows. 5 minutes, announced one of the organizers, peeking behind the curtain. Michael knelt next to Shadow, finding comfort in the familiarity of his presence. Ready, partner? He whispered, stroking the soft fur behind his ears. The German shepherd looked at him with those wise eyes that had seen so much pain transform into hope, so much fear turn into love. His presence was the answer Michael needed. Every ending is just the beginning of something new. Every healing story is a seed that blossoms into more stories. The presenter began to introduce the shelters program, describing how a local initiative had become a national model for rehabilitation and healing. The giant screens showed images of the shelter, the colorful murals, the therapy sessions, the smiling faces of veterans and dogs. And now, announced the presenter, please welcome Michael Andrews and his companion Shadow, the hearts behind this inspiring story. Michael took a deep breath and walked towards the stage, Shadow walking elegantly by his side. The audience fell silent, captivated by the presence of the imposing German shepherd and his handler. A year ago, Michael began, his voice trembling slightly, I walked into an animal shelter feeling lost and broken. I wasn't looking for a dog. I was looking for something I couldn't even name. Shadow sat next to him, his calm presence anchoring Michael's emotional words. In the front row, Peter smiled widely, while Lisa discreetly wiped away a tear. In a cage at the back, Michael continued, I found a dog that reminded me of myself. Empty eyes, distrustful, hurt by experiences that had left invisible scars. But at that moment, I didn't know I was finding much more than a dog. I was finding my way back to life. The images on the screens showed the transformation of the shelter, the before and after, the new programs, the testimonies of other veterans. Anna appeared in one of the shots, working with a rescued dog, her face radiant with renewed purpose. Our program isn't just about rehabilitating dogs or helping veterans, Michael explained. It's about recognizing that sometimes the deepest wounds aren't physical, and that healing can come from the most unexpected sources. Shadow, as if understanding the importance of the moment, maintained his dignified but accessible demeanor. Several people in the audience smiled as they saw how he occasionally looked at Michael, as if offering silent support. Every day in our shelter, Michael continued, his voice gaining strength. We witnessed small miracles. Veterans regaining their smile, dogs learning to trust again, children discovering the power of empathy and patience. The screens then showed Peter reading to the shelter dogs, students painting the murals, Richard and Martin training new volunteers. This award isn't just for Shadow and me, Michael said, his voice laden with emotion. It's for every person and every animal that has been part of our story. For my sister Lisa, who pushed me to take the first step. For Carrie, who believed in our vision. For every veteran who found hope in our program. For every dog that taught us it's never too late to start anew. The silence in the auditorium was absolute, interrupted only by occasional muffled sobs. In the front row, Carrie held Lisa's hand, both visibly moved. But above all, Michael knelt next to Shadow, placing a hand on his back. This recognition is a testament to the power of unconditional love, of how two broken souls can find each other and together rebuild themselves. Shadow turned his head to look at Michael, and at that moment, in front of hundreds of people, they shared a look that said more than 1,000 words. The audience, captivated by the authenticity of the moment, burst into applause. As the president of the jury approached with the award, Michael remained next to Shadow, his hand never leaving his companion's fur. On the screens, a final image showed both of them in the park near their apartment, the setting sun bathing them in golden light. This isn't the end of our story, Michael concluded, his voice firm and clear. It's just the beginning of a new chapter. Because every day in our shelter and in our hearts, we continue to learn that second chances are possible, that healing is a shared journey, and that love, in all its forms, has the power to transform lives. The days following the award ceremony were a whirlwind of emotions and activity. Michael and Shadow's speech had gone viral on social media, touching hearts far beyond the walls of the auditorium. I can't believe the number of messages we're receiving, Carrie commented, showing Michael her phone during breakfast at a cafe near the shelter. Shelters from all over the country want to know more about our program. Shadow rested quietly under the table, occasionally raising his head when a passerby stopped to greet him. His photo alongside Michael on stage had become a symbol of hope and renewal. Uncle Michael, Peter called, running into the cafe with Lisa. My teacher wants us to do a presentation about Shadow in class. Can you come? Michael exchanged a look with his canine companion. What do you say, buddy? Ready to inspire a new generation? The news of the award had generated an unprecedented wave of support. Local businesses began offering donations, new volunteers arrived every day, and more veterans approached seeking help and connection. One morning, as Michael and Shadow were taking their usual walk, an elderly woman stopped them. I saw you on the news, she said with tears in her eyes. My son, he's a veteran too. He hasn't been the same since he came back. Do you think you could help him? Michael felt Shadow gently press against his leg, as he always did when he sensed his emotion. Of course, he replied with a warm smile. The shelter is open to all who seek healing. At the shelter, the impact of the recognition was felt in every corner. Richard had begun training a new group of canine instructors, all veterans who had found their calling in the program. It's like we've created a family, Martin reflected during a training session. One where everyone understands what you've been through even without words. Anna, who now coordinated the welcome program for new veterans, had developed a special bond with a rescued dog named Luna. Shadow showed me the way, she explained, as she petted her new companion. Now it's my turn to do the same for others. Lisa had fully integrated the program into her school curriculum, and other schools were beginning to follow her example. Children were learning about empathy, responsibility, and the power of patience through their interaction with the shelter dogs. You know what's most beautiful? Lisa commented one afternoon, as she watched a group of students working with the dogs. They're learning that strength isn't in hiding pain, but in sharing it and overcoming it together. Michael found Carrie in her office, surrounded by letters and emails from people inspired by their story. Look at this, she said, showing him a particularly emotional letter. It's from a shelter in Seattle. They want to implement our program. I never imagined we'd come this far, Michael replied, as Shadow rested his head on his lap. This far? Carrie smiled. Michael, this is just the beginning. That night in his apartment, Michael sat on the balcony with Shadow, contemplating the illuminated city. The German Shepherd, who was once a fearful shadow in a corner of the shelter, now rested confidently beside him, his presence a constant reminder of how much they had grown together. "Remember when I thought I was saving you?" Michael murmured, scratching his companion's ears. "Every day you show me it was the other way around." A text message lit up his phone. It was a photo of Peter asleep, hugging the award they had received at the ceremony. Lisa had written, "He says when he grows up, he wants to be like his Uncle Michael and help heal broken hearts." Michael smiled, feeling the familiar warmth of tears in his eyes. Shadow moved closer, offering his silent comfort as he always did. "Healing broken hearts," he repeated softly. "Who would have thought that would be our destiny, huh, buddy?" The night enveloped them as they remained there, man and dog, two souls who had found their purpose in helping each other, and in the process had discovered how to help others find their own path towards the light.